She never expected to feel nervous about meeting him. After all, he was just her stepson. But as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the neckline of her dress, she couldn't ignore the slight tremor in her hands. The message had come earlier that day, casual, almost innocent. "I'm in town. Let's catch up?" Her husband was away on business as usual. Lately, their marriage felt like a transaction, filled with brief conversations and empty gestures. She convinced herself there was no harm in meeting him. It was just dinner. The hotel lobby was warm with golden lighting, and the soft hum of conversation filled the air. She spotted him at the far end, leaning back in his chair with effortless confidence. His smile was easy, familiar. But there was something different about him now, something in the way his eyes lingered on her as she walked toward him. "You look incredible," he said, standing to pull out her chair. His voice had changed, deeper, smoother. She smiled, brushing off the compliment, but inside, her pulse quickened. They talked about everything: his studies, her life with his father, the future. But there was an undercurrent beneath his words, an intensity in the way he held her gaze. She dismissed it, convincing herself she was imagining things. Then came the moment that made her breath hitch. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing the back of her hand as he said, "I never really got to know you before. But I always wanted to." It was such a simple sentence, yet loaded with meaning. She gently pulled her hand back, laughing lightly to diffuse the tension. "Well, I'm here now," she said. The evening stretched longer than she intended. When she finally rose to leave, he walked her out, stopping just as they reached the exit. "We should do this again," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she turned to leave, she felt his eyes on her, watching her every step. That night, as she lay in bed, she told herself she was overthinking things. It was just dinner. Just a simple conversation. But deep down, a part of her knew something had changed between them, and it terrified her. The package arrived in the afternoon, wrapped in an elegant black box. She wasn't expecting anything, and when she saw the sender's name, her breath caught. Inside, nestled in soft tissue paper, was a dress, deep red, flowing, and unmistakably expensive. A small card sat on top. "I saw this and thought of you. Hope you like it." Her fingers trembled as she set the card aside. It was a harmless gift. At least, that's what she told herself. But there was an unspoken weight to it, a message hidden beneath the gesture. She should ignore it. She should send it back. Instead, she held the fabric against her body, staring at her reflection longer than she should have. By evening, another message appeared. "Dinner tonight?" No pressure, just good food and conversation. She hesitated. The right thing to do would be to decline. But the memory of last night lingered, the way he looked at her, the attention she hadn't felt in years. Against her better judgment, she replied. The restaurant was dimly lit, intimate. He stood when she arrived, eyes sweeping over her with something dangerously close to admiration. "You wore it," he said, his voice filled with something she couldn't place. She laughed lightly, brushing off the implication. It was too beautiful not to. Dinner was smooth, effortless. But there was an undeniable shift. His compliments were no longer casual. His words carried intent. And for the first time, she didn't stop them. I used to wonder what it would be like if things were different," he said, holding her gaze. Her stomach tightened. "Different how?" He smirked slightly, taking a slow sip of his wine. "If you weren't married to my father." The air between them grew thick, charged. Every alarm in her mind screamed for her to shut this down, to leave. But she stayed. "You shouldn't say things like that," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. He leaned in slightly. "And yet, you're still here?" She had no answer for that. As the night ended, he walked her to the hotel's entrance, pausing before she stepped into the car. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he murmured. The words hung in the air. This was the moment she needed to draw the line. Instead, she whispered, "Good night," and left, knowing full well she had already let him in more than she should have. The message came late at night. I need to see you. Just for a moment. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Every part of her knew she should ignore it. But the truth was, she had been waiting. The silence between them since dinner had been unbearable, filled with unspoken tension that refused to fade. Without overthinking, she grabbed her coat and left. The hotel room was quiet when he opened the door, his expression unreadable. He stepped aside, letting her in without a word. The air felt heavy, as if they both knew there was no turning back from whatever was about to happen. I shouldn't be here, she said softly. But you are? He stood close, too close. His presence was overwhelming, his eyes dark with something that made her pulse quicken. She turned away, needing distance, needing space to think. I don't know what we're doing, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He moved behind her, his voice low. Lying to ourselves. A shiver ran through her. She could feel his warmth, the weight of his gaze. Every rational thought told her to leave, to walk out before it was too late. But then he touched her arm, gentle but deliberate, and something inside her shattered. She turned, meeting his eyes. There was no hesitation in them, no doubt. Only a silent challenge, an invitation. The moment stretched, breathless. And then, without thinking, she closed the distance between them. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But in that instant, she didn't care. Time blurred. The world outside ceased to exist. All that mattered was the way he held her, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. Then, as quickly as it began, reality crashed in. She pulled away, her breath unsteady, her mind racing with the weight of what she had just done. I have to go, she whispered, panic rising in her chest. He reached for her, but she shook her head. This was a mistake. She barely heard his response as she fled, the hotel door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in her bones. As she drove home, guilt clawed at her, suffocating and absolute. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. And now, she had to live with it. Days passed, but the weight of that night never left her. She avoided his calls, his messages, pretending life was normal while guilt gnawed at her from the inside. Every time she looked at her husband, she felt sick. He was oblivious, going about his routine, trusting her without question. If only he knew. She told herself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't just that night. It was everything that led up to it. Every stolen glance, every unspoken thought, every moment she let happen when she should have walked away. Then one evening, her husband mentioned something that made her stomach drop. He's seeing someone new, he said casually over dinner. I think it's serious this time. She nearly dropped her fork. What? Our son. He's been different lately. Happier. I'm glad. He needs someone who understands him. The words barely registered. Her mind raced, piecing everything together. The silence. The avoidance. The sudden shift. He had moved on. She felt cold, her pulse pounding in her ears. Had she been nothing more than a temporary distraction? A forbidden thrill he could discard when it no longer excited him? Shame burned through her, followed by something else. Humiliation. She had risked everything for a moment that clearly meant more to her than it did to him. That night, she lay beside her husband, staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than ever. She couldn't confess. She couldn't undo what had happened. All she could do was carry the weight of her mistake, knowing it was hers alone to bear.